Welcome to the 30th episode of No One is Competent. On this show, we've brought you military disasters, political scandals, corporate malfeasance, and tales of hubris. We want to entertain, but we also aim to show that the folks put in charge of this world aren't smarter than you, and definitely aren't better at their jobs than you are at yours. We think you deserve better leadership. I think I deserve better leadership. What are we talking about today, Jay?
Well, today we're talking about the current governor of Georgia, Brian Kemp, who will be up for re-election on November 8th of this year.
It's the sellout episode! Yes, we have become complete political hacks. The entire point of this episode is that there is a man that I would like voted out of office. I live in Georgia. My governor is Brian Kemp. I think he's a shit stain of a human being, and I don't like him, and I think he's personally hurt almost everyone that I know. For reasons I will explain as we go along. If you... The following program is political propaganda. It also contains some history, some comedy, a lot of, if you just want to learn things about the South, about Georgia, you can do so here. But I am attempting to activate you for a political cause. If you don't like that, stop listening.
I do hope we get, the accusations of us taking money from the Democratic Party or George Soros or whoever. Like, I wish we were getting paid for this. I would take money from the DNC for this.
I mean, Jay's been bribed by J.B. Pritzker for years now, but I don't know. My Soros funding is still in the mail. I think it got flagged by the cops or something. The account hasn't.
I mean, listen, when the great Pritzker Khanate of the Midwestern steppe begins, you're gonna want to be on his good side.
Yes, you will. Yeah, no, I figure, I mean, if we're going to, sell out and become political hacks and deep state operatives, we might as well do it before we have a massive audience, just so we can, get that fully out of the way.
Set the precedent.
Yeah, and I my bones ache for the day when Jay will find a subject that irks him enough that he wants to make it a podcast episode. I mean, that's how the Boeing episode became a thing. That's how
Sure.
That's how a lot of things became a thing. But a more personal grudge, though, Jay, I wouldn't put it past you to have a personal grudge against a plane. You are the host of the podcast, Mr. J. Harry's Brunstead, on Twitter, at JHarrys48. I, of course, am Azalea, at Azalea Wyatt on Twitter. The podcast itself can be reached if you want to ask us questions or request episodes from us. We've done requests before. Please reach out to us at nooneiscompetent@gmail.com. We love hearing from you. Our music is done by the legendary Sam Bryce, and even though this is a political hack, shill, deep state, mockingbird media, brainwashing platform, officially it has no sponsors and no advertisements. So please give back to the show and give us a follow, a subscribe, a 5-star, a like, a review, whatever podcasting app software you're using, and you got the podcast in. Just to interact with the podcast. Push all of the buttons. Just roll your hand across your keyboard. Click around randomly. Just make a sacrifice to the algorithm gods for us, okay? We really appreciate it. We put a lot of work into these. I wrote over half of this yesterday and in a near manic state of getting mad and more mad at the Atlantic Journal newspaper not having links to its old articles still up. Fucking hacks.
Yeah, and I'm sure as most of you can probably tell by now, either because we've talked about it in the past or just by our voices. One of us is from the state of Georgia, and it is very much not me. I've been to Georgia, but not often. And so this is very much an Azalea-led episode.
Yes. Yes, I've lived in Georgia my entire life. I was born in Augusta University Hospital, soon to be or now Piedmont Hospital. I live in Columbia County. I have a bunch of different southern accents. I can completely take it off. I can do like a sort of rich twang. I can do a more high-pitched Appalachian. I can do like a sort of aristocratic, like Frank Underwood kind. My real southern accent only comes out when I am very drunk or very, very stressed out. It is a lot more high-pitched than you'd think. Usually it only twangs certain words. It's funny. I will, whenever I'm talking from anyone who's like white and very clearly from up north, I'll generally lay it on really thick just to fuck with people. But I did grow up in a part of Georgia that's not most people weren't from Georgia itself, but my accent's mostly pretty neutral. But I have a lot of family who live about 15 miles south of nowhere in Cordele, Georgia, which no one listening to this podcast knows where that is, except for my father. Hey, Dad. Yeah, so this is a episode about Georgia politics, about the governor of Georgia. This is probably the smallest scale episode we've done. Maybe you could say that was the Seventh Fleet Disasters, episode 4. Still very proud of that episode. Though that did have a death toll. You could say this episode involves a death toll, but it's a lot harder to nail down a number.
Yeah.
What we mean is that we are relying on sources for this episode that are less. We're not sourcing books or Pulitzer Prize winning articles here. Okay, it's a lot of very scattered reporting of stuff over the course of 12 years of this guy's time in higher political office. I'm just gonna rattle out all of them super fast. Georgia governor ignored experts as pandemic raised by Alan Judd for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. From reopening to masks, how Georgia Governor Kemp has handled the coronavirus pandemic. Meredith Deliso for ABC News. Curve in context. Is Georgia representing COVID numbers? For First Coast News. Brian Kemp owes more than $800,000 in insider loans to bank he helped start by Dale Russell for Fox 5 Atlanta. Georgia sent out CDs of data for 6 million voters containing Social Security numbers, birth dates by Megan Guss of Ars Technica. Obama's secret struggle to punish Russia for Putin's election assault by Greg Miller, Ellen Nakashima, and Adam Mantus for the Washington Post. Incompetence or a cover-up by Jeremy Stahl for Slate. How dismantling the Voting Rights Act helped Georgia discriminate again by Brett and Mock for Bloomberg. Register minority voters in Georgia, go to jail by Spencer Woodman for the New Republic. In leaked audio, Brian Kemp expresses concern over Georgians exercising their voting rights by PR Lockhart for Vox. And general COVID statistics were sourced from the New York Times and Statista. That's Statista talk word. Okay. We are good podcasters, good at our job, been doing this a long time. 30 fucking episodes, Jay.
Yeah.
Plus the bonus forbidden episode that no one's allowed to know about. 31, really. Oh, shut up. The QAnon episode doesn't count as 2 episodes because it was one thing. They're both full podcast length. Shut up. So this episode, again, is a Mockingbird Media CIA plot, deep lib shill political hit piece This is not our traditional podcast format. Generally, we talk about a singular event. We've talked about careers before, Rudy Giuliani, of incompetence. I think Brian Kemp is incompetent about a lot of stuff. We'll be talking more about how he's malicious rather than just actively bad at what he does. He's very good at doing certain things, which are very nasty. Brian Kemp is only able to do what he does because he is a member of the Georgian Republican Party and larger the Georgian political establishment. So we will be talking about Brian Kemp in detail. You will learn a lot of funny things about him, but we also just need to explain like how Georgia politics works, because Georgia politics and Georgia politicians are the real subject of this episode. At least half of it. Brian Kemp is kind of, shall we say, the vehicle through which the Georgia politics is fucking with people's lives and is making all of us incompetent. So first, of course, in classic Socratic method, we must ask, what is Georgia? Georgia. 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 Is that all of them? I think that's all of them. All right, so Georgia falls into a weird space in the American consciousness because it's what you might call a second-tier state. Like, it's not fuck-off weird state that's so small in either size or population that it's strange that it even exists. It's not flyover country, but it's also not one of the big boys. You know, California, New York, Texas, Florida. Those are the states that people care about in this country. And so Georgia kind of flies under the radar, with folks not really appreciating how cool and weird and important it is. And yes, I did use this podcast just as an excuse to talk about how I come from a really cool place, and more people need to know about it.
I feel like if you have to say that your state isn't flyover country, it might be flyover country.
Shut the fuck up. Shut the fuck up. DC. Y'all are aware that Jay is a DC liberal, right? Okay, like he's the elite. All right, he shops at Whole Foods and he drinks fucking Starbucks. Okay, he knows nothing of the salt of the earth.
Well, I'm from Illinois, so also semi-debatably flyover country, but it's neither here nor there.
But you feel what I'm saying, right, Jay? Because like Illinois is a very economically powerful, very diverse state, but it is not one of the states that people talk about all the time, even though there's probably a lot that could be discussed.
People outside of the U.S. generally will not be able to put Illinois on a map, or like even tell you that like Chicago is in it. Like I feel like a lot of people have heard more of Chicago than they've heard of Illinois. At least that's my experience talking with people not from America, which is, you know, kind of understandable.
At least they know your capital exists.
And Chicago's not even the capital.
Yeah, so that's apparently there was some like World War II general who got like detained by a private because he thought he was a spy, and he asked him what the capital of Illinois was, and he said Springfield, and the private thought it was Chicago and detained him.
Yeah, that sounds about right. Back to Georgia, and just a brief note, there is also a country called Georgia with its own fascinating history. We might do some episodes on it eventually.
I am not related to Joseph Stalin.
It's not what we're talking about today. The Georgia we're talking about
I have much better facial hair than Joseph Stalin.
Yeah, I can vouch for that.
Thank you, Jay. I appreciate the compliment.
So the Georgia we are talking about today is the youngest state, the original 13 colonies.
Lucky number 13.
Yeah. You know, for a while it was overshadowed by its big brothers, North Carolina and Virginia. But early on, it quickly became core to the southeastern United States, part of, you know, the quote-unquote South.
Yeah, no one ever talks about, like, Arizona as being part of the South. Or, it's weird, like, I mean, there are parts of Pennsylvania that are in the South. It's not really it's not a geographic term. If you live outside the United States, we're referring to the southeast of the country. It's more of a cultural idea of the South. But everyone in America knows what the South is, and Georgia is more or less at the dead center of it.
Yeah. And a lot of our perception of the South really has to do with, the states that formed the Confederacy. It's not perfect, because there were Union states which had slaves. There are states that are part of the Confederacy that maybe nowadays aren't quite seen as being, the South, or at least not the Deep South, but it's generally kind of how it goes. Georgia's economy was dominated by cash crop slave plantations, and thus it was one of those states that rebelled along with the rest to form the Confederacy. Now, after the Civil War, Georgia was dominated by the same class of rich white supremacists who had been in charge before the war. But a century later, the state would become the heart of the civil rights movement and birth its most prominent leader, Martin Luther King Jr. These two forces would clash to create the politically polarized state that we know and love today, but we're getting ahead of ourselves a little bit.
Georgia is a big state, bigger than fucking England. It's got a big old diverse environment. You want mountains? We got mountains. You want beaches? We got beaches. Plains, hills, everything in between. A lot of fucking agriculture. Peanuts, watermelons, cotton. Largest producer of pecans in the world. In the summer, the temperature ranges from pretty warm in the mountains to mercy, Jesus is a fucking broiler out there. That's summer. Winters are mild. Storm season rarely brings anything to worry about. Almost 11 million people live in Georgia. That's twice the population of Finland, by the way, okay? We're way more important than Finland. And around 55% of those people live in the state's capital of Atlanta. So, Jay, funny thing about Atlanta, the 404, as we like to sometimes call it. Generally, you can tell how far someone lives from Atlanta based on how they pronounce Atlanta. If you're from the South, you would say Atlanta, kind of like with the T sort of underemphasized. And if you live in Atlanta itself, you just say like Atlanta. That is the easy way to tell who is native and who is not. Atlanta is not bound by any sort of geographical barrier. So it's just this massive city that is sprawling into suburban, exurban hell. It's kind of hard to determine like the population of the city because like what city and what suburb, there is no delineation between the two.
A lot of the cities are like that in America, especially a lot of the newer cities or the cities that grew up around the railroads.
Yeah, and Atlanta is, well, one, it was the railroad terminus in the state for a very long time, but it also is one of the sort of young growing cities in the American Sun Belt, much like Phoenix, Arizona, that people have been moving to in significant waves for the past, say, 20, 30 years. So partially because of that big old city, Georgia is one of the most diverse states in the Union. It's about half white and a third black. The numbers are kind of hard to calculate because we have a lot of mixed race folk. Almost 10% of the population speaks Spanish, and we have one of the fastest growing Asian American populations in the country. Drive around Clark County, and it's easy to find a strip mall where all the signs are in Korean. I speak from personal experience being very lost and then being very, very, very confused.
Now, Georgia's population is young relative to that of the country as a whole, and the vibrant city of Atlanta, and I should note, after being criticized many times for mispronouncing Atlanta, the script here reads Atalanta, as in the hero from Greek mythology. But yes, Atalanta is estimated to have the third largest LGBT plus population in the country.
Listen, Mang, sometimes you take a lot of Adderall and alcohol and you just start typing it at 11:30 p.m., okay? Don't judge me.
I do sometimes just like randomly call Atalanta by mistake because I'm somewhat of a nerd for Greek mythology.
Who would have thought?
I'm not from Atlanta. But yeah, this state is also overwhelmingly religious, with over 3/4 of its population claiming to be some sort of Christian.
Just for context, the city that I live in, or outside of, Augusta, has the third largest amount of churches per capita of cities in the United States. We got denomination, we got Mormons, it's not just Baptists and Methodists, man. We got Presbyterians, Unitarians, we got fucking Coptics, we got Greek Orthodox. We've got mosques, we've got hella synagogues. We are out the fucking wazoo.
If any of you do ever come up to DC, there is a street in DC where you can basically just drive down and you just go by like church by church by church. It's like, oh, those are the Ethiopians and they're the Copts and there's like the Baptists and they're Catholics. It's pretty cool.
I am a fan of Lutheran church architecture. I think it's
Lutherans are some of the best, at it. But yeah, Georgia is still a part of, the South. We tend to generalize in this country, painting large parts of it with broad brushes. We speak of the Midwest and New England and the South, which has perhaps the most loaded connotation. Most Americans think of the South as a bigoted and backwards place, behind on the times and openly decaying. They think of rotting trailer parks and small towns dotted with "Don't Tread on Me" flags, massive crop fields, and old women clutching their Bibles. Now that is true for most of the South, and it's kind of true for Georgia, but it's also not.
All right. Georgia is the 9th largest economy in the United States. Despite being middle of the road for income, the state's GDP is over $650 billion a year. That's almost double the economy of Egypt, and for scale, it is almost triple the economy of Alabama, which is a similarly sized state just right next door. Large corporations like Coca-Cola, Home Depot, and Delta are headquartered in Georgia. It's the industrial and financial hub of the South. The Atlanta airport is one of the busiest airports, not only in the country, but in the world. Its third largest city hosts Fort Gordon, which is the nexus of the country's cyber war capacity. About 100 miles downriver from there is the Savannah River site, which has created the fuel for every nuclear bomb America's made for the last 70 years. Savannah is the third largest port in America and takes in the largest amount of container freight. The state has the largest rail network in the South. We have a booming textile industry, a Kia Motors plant, and massive nuclear power plants which provide a fourth of the state's electricity. A lot of good fucking union jobs at those plants, which conveniently take 27 years to fully build and probably a shit ton of graft, but it's great for everybody. This is all dwarfed by the cultural output of the state. Quick question, Jay. You see that movie 2018 film, Black Panther?
I did, yes.
What'd you think of it?
Pretty good. I enjoyed it.
It's one of the best Marvel movies by far. Solid 8 out of 10. Very, very good. Love the adventures in Wakanda. You know where Wakanda is, Jay?
Well, I somewhat do, but I'm sure you're about to tell me and the audience nonetheless.
Wakanda is in Georgia. That's where all of those scenes were filmed, along with almost all of the Marvel movies and The Walking Dead. For the last 5 years, more films have been made in Georgia than California. The state has a massive film industry, from Tyler Perry's personal studio out of Atlanta to the studio I will not name that makes every shitty Christian movie you've heard mocked of but never actually seen, that are all shot in Albany. From Atlanta to Augusta to Athens, the state has redefined the world of music. Ray Charles, REM, James Brown, the B-52s, Migos, Otis Redding, the Allman Brothers, Lady Antebellum, Wycliffe Gordon, Usher, Luke Bryan, Ludacris, the Zac Brown Band, Childish Gambino, Lil Nas X, 21 Savage, 2 Chainz, and more Atlanta rappers that I could possibly name. Atlanta is the beating heart of the American hip-hop industry. Athens has started more music trends than you can even comprehend, and the state hosts one of the largest ska festivals in the country, which is something you find out when you're scrolling through Wikipedia. The University of Georgia, the state's flagship university, regularly dominates the nation in college football, while the Atlanta Falcons are consistently the least consistent team in the NFL, with wildly varying seasons in a stadium that is affectionately referred to as Megatron's butthole. Augusta Tech is a world-renowned engineering program, and Augusta hosts some of the best nursing programs in the country. Once again, the state is also one of the most diverse in the Union. Many of the towns in the Southwest are majority black. There are thriving Puerto Rican, Vietnamese, and Senegalese populations. That's just in my hometown. We have one of the largest illegal immigrant populations in the country, so much so that you can actually occasionally find good Mexican food if you know where to look. The amount of different people in the state is astounding. All right, this is what I want to get across. Okay, because Georgia has all of the stuff that you think of it having, and it has all of the stuff that you don't think of it having. Okay, this is a state where where the sound of the start of duck season is like World War III, the creepiest country club you'll ever lay eyes on, an inner-city rap scene, a Fortune 500 corporate headquarters, a poverty-stricken trailer park, and a gleaming tech startup. Those things can all be within 30 miles of one another in Georgia. You know, we hosted the Olympics. We had the most important golf tournament of the year. The biggest white supremacist monument arguably in the world. Swamps with alligators and rattlesnakes. 2 U.S. presidents from here. There's like these weird islands off the coast with like wild horses. Okay, CNN, Cartoon Network are hosted here. We grow these like weird onions that are sweet instead of spicy. We have the oldest public school in the country. There's this place in Chris County where
I think we kind of get the point. we know it. You like your state. Are you really going anywhere with this?
Cool. And it's important, and that's why it's so awful that it's run by a bunch of shit-eating ghouls.
Briefly, I will say, the one time I have been to Atlanta, I saw, all your important cultural artifacts, including the Coca-Cola headquarters and Stone Mountain. So, yeah.
Did you climb to the top?
I did not.
It's not too like it'll take you like a solid like 45 minutes, like hour, but it's a good hike, but it's not like a hike. Like it's you're not climbing. Largest freestanding granite formation for a long ways away, and we carved a goddamn relief of Confederate generals.
Yeah, it's
God
like
bless America.
Mount Rushmore, in referring to the actual carvings, is kind of shitty, and they should not exist. It's not a good thing. That being said, when I did go to Stone Mountain, I did kind of enjoy the fact that like the Confederate Mount Rushmore is just like a kind of pathetic carving into a granite face, as opposed to the actual Mount Rushmore, which is, again, should not exist, but is far more impressive as a work of art, I suppose.
For anyone who thinks of accusing Jay of being a woke hack, I have known Jaharis for years, and I assure you that all of his strongest opinions are not because of anything being politically problematic and have purely to do with his own aesthetic personal leanings. All right.
Yeah. I mean, at least pick some different presidents from Mount Rushmore. I think at least 1 or 2 of those guys probably shouldn't be on there.
They didn't even finish it. Planned to have all of them like in full statue, and they carved like the breast, like upper chest of Washington, and stopped because the whole thing was like a boondoggle of a weirdo. Jay, explain Georgian politics to me.
As a former member of the Confederacy, Georgia joined the rest of the South in creating a society of racial apartheid after the war. Decades of private lynchings and public Jim Crow laws allowed white Georgians to dominate the state politically, and many blacks left for the North as part of the Great Migration, seeking jobs and safety.
The former slave population after the war in Georgia was half of, perhaps even more than half of the state. All right, that's why part of the reason all of the segregation and keeping black people from voting had to happen is that if those people were allowed to vote, they would have won all of the elections because there's more of them. They would have voted their people into power. Briefly, they did. We talked about that in our Reconstruction episode. Now, of course, blacks are not half of the population of Georgia because they were forced to leave by violence and the economic conditions. And this is true for pretty much all of the southern states.
Just as Georgia was the heart of white supremacy within America, it also became the home of the American Civil Rights Movement, helmed by Georgia's own Martin Luther King Jr. The state, just like most of the South, was forcibly desegregated. Schools were integrated, and people of color were allowed to vote. Hypothetically, we'll get back to that in a little bit.
So, federal integration and desegregation involved physically moving a lot of kids around, busing them from, say, the inner cities to the suburbs, and vice versa. That was very important. Once white kids were having to go to black schools, what were formerly black schools, now integrated schools, those schools, of course, overnight got a ton of funding. And this was transformational to the entire state and is within living memory. Okay, I attended UGA for a year, and for a year I lived in a dorm that had a neighboring dorm that had hosted a race riot when my mother was 2 years old. Okay, this is not ancient history. The South is culturally different from a lot of the United States, and especially the northeastern United States, because in the South, we do not keep the underclass and ugly stuff far away from our ruling class. Okay, this is, you won't find places like the mini country club laden rich retreats of, say, Connecticut or New Hampshire in the South. The beauty and the rot is right next to each other. That comes all the way back from the time when there was the master's house and the slave's house. So you'll often have these situations all across Georgia and the South where you'll have like sort of two communities. A lot of this has to do with white flight. Once integration happened and schools were attended by both black and white students, a lot of private schools were established for the upper class whites to send their kids to. Famously, the International Baccalaureate program at Academy of Richmond County. That's the whole reason that exists. As soon as segregation was outlawed, people were trying to get around that rule, and a huge part of that was just trying to move away. So using my city of Augusta as an example, Augusta proper is inside of Richmond County. But a lot of Augusta, like the suburbs of Augusta, places that have names like Martinez, Grovetown, Evans, and even then farther out to like Appling, those are technically in Columbia County, which is much wealthier and significantly wider. Now, to be clear, Columbia County is way more ethnically diverse than your average county in fucking Wyoming or Maine, but it's far different because in like the 60s and 70s, a lot of the upper class folk and white folk of Richmond County moved to the then expanding Columbia County and then commuted into the city in order to attend their jobs. Okay, they took the money they made in the city out of it. This, of course, leads to decay of social services and a decaying tax base and whatnot. This is what has caused the current crisis in Jackson, Mississippi that's going on right now. there are around 10 times more murders every year in Richmond County than Columbia County. The life expectancy is 11 years apart. I live in a town where you can drive 15 minutes from one school to another school, and the school you started at has a graduation rate of 96%, and the school you ended at has a graduation rate of 46%. The beauty and the rot are right next to each other. And this process perpetuates, okay? My parents moved to Columbia County. They're not from Augusta. My dad's from Southern California, and my mom's from Macon. They wanted to afford a decent home in a decent neighborhood in a decent school district while working in Augusta. And my dad worked in Wrightsville at the time. And so they bought a house where the houses were cheaper and the place was safer and the public school districts were way better, and that just happened to be in Columbia County. So Columbia County is now getting all of the young, upwardly mobile families of people with degrees, okay? And you see how this cycle perpetuates. Hilarious, like there are no private schools, to my knowledge, in Columbia County. There's tons of them in Richmond County. Because in Columbia County, the private schools weren't needed. And by needed, I mean in needing a place to send the white kids to be away from the black kids.
Yeah.
We clear on how that works?
I think so.
I think this sort of historical stuff makes a lot more sense once you have an actual real world example. Because I mean, I live with this shit every day of my life, and I used to be very conservative. My politics have been all over the place in my lifetime, but it was very obvious to me as a child. And I mostly, for context, I went to church in Richmond County. In Augusta, I had a lot of friends there, and when I went into the workforce in public service and in management, I worked mostly in inner city Augusta. So I have been very much in both worlds, and even as a teenager, it was obvious to me that fuckery and inequality had gone down. Because it was you could just see it with your eyes driving from 10 minutes down the road from one place to the next.
Now, the later half of the 20th century also saw Georgia grow increasingly rich and as a haven for corporate power. The state now held a very powerful class of rich whites, which we kind of talked about a little bit, a very large class of working class whites who weren't very politically mobilized, and a large class of working class blacks who had been very heavily politically organized in the past, and also you have an increasingly growing class of middle class folk of new races, not new, and increasingly a growing class.
Down here in Georgia, we're so smart, we invented a whole new bunch of races.
See, the word folk just throws me off.
Why don't you say folk? It's okay, if you have to say, I think if you say, for example, Vietnamese people, I think that sounds like way more awkward and charged than saying, Vietnamese folk. Everyone's just folk. There's straight folk, queer folk, trans folk, cis folk, white folk, black folk, everybody folk, okay?
Yeah. And increasingly a growing class of middle-class people of races across the spectrum in America who have college education and moved to the state for jobs and lower housing costs. This new group will kind of be caught in the middle of the political divide. The other big development in the late 1900s was the great American political realignment and polarization. Over 100 years after the Civil War, Georgia, along with most of the South, reliably voted for the Democratic Party. The Republican Party was the party of Lincoln.
They shot my grandpappy!
But by the turn of the 21st century, the state was voting reliably for that party of Lincoln. So what happened?
Well, this is going to be kind of mind-blowing, but 70 years ago, the two big American political parties were not that different in terms of politics. I know it's weird. It's really hella weird, and we forget about it. But back in those days, the parties were coalitions. There were progressive Republicans and there were progressive Democrats. There were conservative Republicans who worked with pro-segregation Democrats. Okay, it was very regional in, like, say, the 20s through the 70s. And we could speak for 2 hours on why this changed, why we now think of the Republicans as the conservative party in America, and why we think of the Democrats as the moderate or liberal party in America. The simplest way I can explain it is that by luck and circumstance, the Democrat Party ended up being the party who signed the New Deal into law, and then 20 years later signed the Civil Rights Act into law. There were plenty of Democrats who opposed the New Deal. Lord knows there were plenty of Democrats who opposed the Civil Rights Act. There were Republicans who thought the New Deal was a great idea and wanted to do something similar, and there were Republicans who supported the Civil Rights Movement at the time. But the Democrat Party is the one that, through just happenstance of history, ended up doing that. And that 1-2 punch slowly polarized the Republicans into being a party voted for by those against a social safety net or equality for people of color, because that is how the Democrats distinguished themselves. Famously, after the signing of the Civil Rights Act in 1965, Lyndon Baines Johnson, president at the time, from Texas, said, "We've lost the South for a generation." The funny thing was, he was wrong. Like it took another, really 20, 30 years after that for the process to fully take into effect. By the 70s and 80s, Republicans were starting to win in Georgia, and it soon became thought of as a solidly red Republican state. For a while, there was a lot of ticket splitting. Like, you'd commonly vote Republican for higher office, but Dems could do well in local races. By the time I was a kid, that had mostly gone away. Jay, you ever heard of the concept of a Dixiecrat?
I do remember them from AP US History back in high school.
Yeah, so Dixiecrats are what we call the people who, in like the 60s, 70s, 50s, were in the Democratic Party. They were Democrats, but they were not like any Democrat politician who is alive today. And most of them actually switched parties to the Republican Party. I have actually a personal connection to this because for a solid 8 years, my grandmother, my mama, if your mama and your mama are two different people, you might be a redneck. My grandmother dated a Georgia state senator. His name is Rudy, if you want to look him up. And I'll have to ask her exactly. It might have been like the late 70s or early 80s. He was a Democrat, and he was just informed by his colleagues that you're going to run as a Republican for reelection next round. And he did. That was just the line of what everyone was doing, and he followed the trend. And I remember a guy from when I was 7 and feeding catfish who apparently did that. Georgia was always a conservative state, and when the Republicans became conservative, Georgia went to the Republicans. And Georgia kept itself on the bleeding edge of conservatism, despite its sizable population of people of color and its growing educated cities, mainly through fuckery.
Obviously, in the old days, the ruling class used poll taxes and arcane rules to keep people of color out of elections. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 was supposed to put an end to all of that. Basically, the state would now have to submit any changes it wanted to make to voting to the federal government before implementing it. Think of that as a racism check. But then in 2013, the Supreme Court gutted that section of the Voting Rights Act. John Roberts reasoned that the act was only constitutional when it was written because of the rampant civil rights abuses in the South, and that now that American racism was famously over, it was no longer constitutional. He said that the law was based on 40-year-old facts that have no logical relationship to the present day.
No logical relationship to the present day. God help us all. We'll go more into Georgian voter suppression in a bit, but the big headliner that illustrates the problem is gerrymandering. This is the process of drawing an electoral district to make it as uncompetitive as possible. Instead of voters picking the politicians are picking the voters. To spoil the podcast a little bit, Georgia is not 100% or 90% Republican. So in order to keep Republican domination, they have to weaken Republican political power. And to be clear, gerrymandering has been done all across the United States and all across the world where it's able to be done in democracies. And it's done plenty by Democrats in other areas. The Republicans have just been in power to do it. The main tactic is diluting the power of potential Democrat voters, mixing them in with a lot of Republicans to make it hard for them to affect an election. And when that's not possible, the inverse tactic is used. Computer programs draw district lines of algorithmic precision, packing as many Democrat voters as possible into a few districts that will isolate their support. And for, again, 1,000 reasons that could be a 2-hour podcast, people of color are far more likely to vote for the Democratic Party. To illustrate this, let's go through Georgia's 14 seats in the House of Representatives. In 2020, the 8 that went to the Republican Party were won in landslides. And of the 6 that were won by Democrats, 4 of those were also won in blowouts, okay? The most competitive district won by a Republican member of Congress was carried by 58% of the vote. My district, that guy's a fucking piece of... And you wouldn't think that those kind of blowouts would be so common in a state whose presidential election of that year was decided by 12,000 votes. Oh, yeah, I guess we should talk about that. So Georgia voted for Joe Biden in 2020. Politically, this was kind of a hashtag moment, you know, like a lot of people argued that Georgia was trending towards Dem control or contestation for a few years. But then it's kind of like the pages of the history book kind of got stuck together, and it was like suddenly Georgia is blue. Do not expect Georgia to be consistently Democrat for the next 12 years. It's going to go back and forth a whole lot. We'll actually get into that. The full reason why the state voted for Joe Biden is a whole podcast in itself, but suffice to say, Donald Trump was a very bad candidate and lost the state for the GOP for the first time in 28 years. Hillary Clinton had lost the state by over 2 million votes in 2016, and the Dems made up all of that and more. 2020 saw a 6% increase in Georgia's voter participation. Lots of reasons. Yada, yada, yada. The administration's bungling of COVID. Yada, yada, yada. Suburban white women. Yada, yada. Biden's support amongst black voters. The election result happened. This shocked a lot of people because Georgia was not thought of as a traditional swing state. It's not Pennsylvania or Wisconsin or Ohio or Florida or whatever. Dems had long dreamed of breaking the Republican hold on the most diverse region of the country, but the good money had on, say, North Carolina or Florida going first. Georgia was thought of as prime maggot country. And a lot of Georgia is prime MAGA country. Lord knows I've met a lot of them while I was managing a business and trying to get hicks to wear fucking masks. Hell, I am related to a lot of them, but Georgia contains multitudes. Georgia is not a swing state because it contains a large amount of voters that could be swayed from one candidate to another. That's how we generally think of purple states, or states that are in the middle in this country. Rather, it's a state that contains a near equal amount of highly polarized people on either side. Okay, Georgians are pretty radical folk. We all want our state to change. We all hate each other. Almost everyone's got a party they're willing to vote for. This is increasingly happening in the entirety of America and probably in other countries. But for Georgians, when it's time for them to vote, the decision they make is not whether they're going to vote for one party or another. There's always one party they're going to vote for, more or less. The question is whether or not they're going to vote for the party they are aligned with, or whether or not they're going to not vote at all. Most of them don't vote at all. The state's elections are less about persuading a middle and more about turning out as much of a base as possible, getting them excited and invested in voting. So yeah, there's a lot of rural white Georgia. There's also a fair amount of rural black Georgia, and also the Atlanta suburbs, which sprawl further every day.
Yeah, this is a state of rampant political division that is only growing every year. It's a powder box of rage where Republican innovation to suppress democracy is only outdone by their opponents' ability to turn out voters. It's a state where few have a neutral opinion on anything. In Georgia, competition over elections has not increased consensus or created a common ground. Instead, the man in the middle of this is a gutless radical hell-bent on killing everything great about arguably the most unique state in the Union.
That arguably is not in the script. Fuck you, Jay.
And what's worse is that he's not even doing it in a dramatic way. He's not burning it to the ground. Rather, he's smothering it like a child beneath a pillow.
Before we move on to Brian Kemp, to elaborate just a pitch more on what the previous section, Nate Silver, famously the elections guy, he's referred to Georgia as being inelastic in its politics.
Famous epidemiologist Nate Silver.
The state, there's not a lot of persuadable voters. There are some, but it is kind of, it's more of, it's a lot of people locked in. And for a long time, you had this Democrat base and growing support that was sort of simmering under the surface, and it just sort of, because of, again, 1,000 reasons, burst forward in 2020. And, you know, demographically, Georgia looks like a lot of the more liberal parts of the country, okay, between the large people of color population and all of the people with degrees moving there and whatnot. You know, as a kid, I knew tons of people whose parents were from the North or the Midwest and had degrees and moved to Georgia for jobs and, you know, good housing prices. And that brings in people who are not as conservative, who have different worldviews, and it allows for the state to change. And again, while the state still, again, retains tons of radical shit, tons of the beauty, the glory, and the horror that comes with rural, religious, conservative America. Both of them are in the state, and I think that's cool. Jay, tell me about Brian Kemp.
Well, Brian was born on November 2nd in 1963 outside of Athens, Georgia, a moderately sized city. Kemp grew up doing farm work, attending a local private school, and playing football. It's hard to, actually find that much information about his family, kind of surprisingly. I also did some research myself, and, I only got very vague details.
Incredibly vague, weirdly vague.
Yeah.
Probably paid some people to scrub the internet a bit. That's very common for politicians all across America.
Yeah. Kemp himself would graduate from the University of Georgia in the 80s with a degree in agriculture. From what I can tell, his father was in real estate, but I can't really find out how big.
I was wondering about that because you have this guy who graduates in his early 20s with an agriculture degree, and then in his 40s, as he's moving into political life, he is worth between $1 to $6 million depending on who you ask in the time. And how do you move from point A to point B?
But yeah, so Kemp starts in building and selling homes and moves on to investing in several local businesses in the bank, and like you said, he becomes a millionaire. Some sources speculate that the man's start in politics was motivated by changing local zoning codes.
There are some mild scandals involving Brian's finances in this period. He was sued over allegations that he cheated folks out of loans and settled it out of court. Some local news reporters have investigated him for using loans from a bank that he was on the board of to keep his own businesses afloat during the Great Recession. It's all run-of-the-mill shady shit. It's not particularly out of place in Georgia politics. We have real corruption coming later, don't you worry. And when we say that Brian invested in businesses and made money in real estate, what we mean is he made money by already having money, okay? This guy's got an agriculture degree. He put the money in the ground, and he grew more of it. It's clear that the guy got a good old diversified portfolio working for himself. Once he hit 40s, the whole thing was probably running on its own power, and so he decided to get into politics. And again, this is purely my speculation based on the evidence available. Maybe Brian had a burning passion for public service, but real estate developers reaching for political power once they get bored of just being rich is very, very, very common in Georgia. I fucking love seeing my congressman's name not only on elect me signs, but also on I'm the person who's turning this park into a apartment complex signs. It's totally normal, good society. So Brian's grandfather and father-in-law had both held office in the state legislature. Family ties, along with business connections and his personal wealth, probably served him well as he ran for the state senate in 2002. He won that race and was reelected in 2004. 2 years later, he lost an election for state commissioner of agriculture. Shame he never got to use that degree of his. Kemp went back to the private sector, and in early 2010, Georgia's Secretary of State stepped down as she enters the state's primary for governor.
I wonder why she did that.
Yeah, I wonder why. It's weird. Then Governor Sonny Perdue appointed Kemp to fill that job. And with personal connections gifting him the incumbency, Brian would win that election later that year and again in 2014 before he became governor in 2018. So he was Secretary of State for 8 years and served 2.3 terms. Brian's incompetence is not as specific as we usually highlight in this show. He's demonstrated all sort of monstrosity over his career, but instead of going through it in a chronological order, we're going to tackle it subject by subject, which I think is going to give us more structure in painting a picture of this guy and why he needs to be removed from office.
Yeah, eventually this episode is going to get really dark, and Azalea is going to get really angry, so we figured we'd first discuss Brian's run for the gubernatorial primary in 2018, as it's quite hilarious, and it helps us get an idea of the guy's personality.
Or lack thereof.
Early 2018 was perhaps the pinnacle of Trump's influence on the Republican Party. This was before COVID, before the party's loss of the midterms. Trump was the GOP savior. He had come out of nowhere and delivered them victory. Candidates for local offices across the country were pitching themselves as his most vocal supporters, and increased the vitriol of their rhetoric to match his extreme positions on culture war issues. This was not a time of level-headed governance or demonstrating solid strength to voters. It was a time to prove yourself a fiery brawler for the conservative cause.
Brian went into a crowded 6-person primary aiming to be the flashiest candidate in the race. The man's primary ads were a buffet of cringe. Like, he would say, "I'm gonna blow up government spending," and a small fireball erupts behind him. He's awkwardly brandishing a chainsaw while promising to rip up regulation. My favorite moment comes as he leans his elbow out of a hideous F-350 pickup truck. He says, "I got a big truck," Kemp says before shutting the door for emphasis, "just in case I need to round up criminal illegals and round them up myself." He primes the engine before a close-up on his face, and he says, "Yep, I just said that," with painfully forced enthusiasm. There is a flailing awkwardness to all of these ads. You should watch them. Like, they come across as cynical and forced, like a man trying to play act extremism. Kemp's from the South, okay? He's dealt with cows. It's not like he doesn't have actual like redneck credibility, but he's clearly hamming all of this up. And bad acting and faux machismo, it's par for the course of Georgia politics. If you want to see platinum stupidity, you got to look at the Jake ad. Jay, you knew about the Jake ad before we started researching this podcast episode, right? Like, this
yes.
thing was so cringe in 2018, It briefly broke containment.
Yep.
The Jake ad is one of the few ads you can still find from this campaign on YouTube. It's 30 seconds, fever dream of obscene morality. Okay, it shows Kemp sitting in a chair, and the chair next to him is a teenage boy that has been called Jake. I've only known one other person in this entire state named Jake. No one here is named Jake. Why the fuck would you call him Jake? The two are inside what I guess is supposed to be Brian's home, and there are several improperly stored firearms racked in the background. Jake is supposed to be a boy that's trying to date one of Brian's daughters, and he rattles off Kemp's main campaign promises, all while Kemp holds a long gun in his lap pointed in the young man's general direction. And, this is like all actors and props, but I want y'all to think. This video shows a man who's supposed to be this salt-of-the-earth redneck, showing off his improper storage of firearms, complete lack of basic gun safety, and willingness to threaten a minor. In a video that he made, that he wanted to show to the world. And he's awkwardly holding the gun. He closes the ammo case on it and folds it up, and there's a weird cloth over it for some reason, probably to mask that it's a bad prop, and it's just you don't have a gun loaded inside. You don't point a gun at anyone.
I always treat a gun as if it's loaded. That's basic.
I once did some training with the U.S. National Guard, and I got yelled at for pointing a gun in the general direction of the people, and the gun I was holding had cement poured down the barrel. This thing just fries my. This is like the Alec Baldwin thing. It's just an amount of. Considering the gun safety that was drilled in my head as a kid, this thing just burns my brain.
Yeah. Kemp came in second in this primary and advanced to runoff against Lieutenant Governor Casey Cagle.
It's perhaps worth mentioning that runoff elections are extremely easy to do in Georgia elections, or rather the requirements for triggering them are quite easy to make. So they're very regular, especially in primaries where there's a bunch of candidates and no one gets a majority.
Yeah. Cagle was the establishment favorite going into the election and ran as a more moderate, level-headed candidate than Kemp. Brian Kemp only increased his rhetoric in turn after endorsement from Donald Trump, and this allowed him to crush Cagle in the runoff. Throughout the campaign, Kemp had emphasized his more extreme and violent campaign positions. He promised to lock up Hispanics with impunity and pass the harshest abortion restrictions in the country. Even his more standard economic positions were delivered with an edge of violence and extremism. The stated point was generally to trigger the libs, but to me it comes across as more of conservative virtue signaling. You can watch the ads for yourself if you'd like, as we mentioned. The Democratic primary was decided between two women, both named Stacey, and the more charismatic of the two, Stacey Abrams, went on to face Kemp in the 2018 general election.
As summer turned to fall and November loomed closer, Abrams, local reporters, and concerned citizens asked Kemp why he hadn't stepped down from his position as Secretary of State before the election. So secretaries of state for nations, like the Secretary of State for the country, the cabinet member, handles diplomacy for the nation and communicates with foreign powers. You're not going to need to do that if you're a state that's in the country. So, what do secretaries of state for states do?
The Secretary of State, among other things, oversees and is responsible for all that state's elections. Brian Kemp was fully intending to run for governor in a race that he would oversee and referee. Now is a great time to look at Kemp's time as Georgia's Secretary of State. Not only does it contain some prime incompetence, but it also shows off when he thinks about certain groups of people. Beginning with the rank incompetence, in 2015, Kemp's office was sending out CDs containing the names of Georgia's voters to 12 different media organizations and political parties. Anyone can order these lists for $500, and they contain names along with demographic information, but these lists also bundled in social security numbers and driver's license numbers for each citizen. Kemp's office didn't alert Georgians to the leak until they were sued and the case was reported on.
Georgia uses a purely digital system of voting. These machines are simple and, in my experience, are mostly supervised by senior citizens. There are plenty of security flaws at every level of Georgia elections, flaws that Kemp seemed to work to keep in place and cover up. In 2016, the Department of Homeland Security reached out to Kemp's office to improve election security, and Kemp very publicly turned them down. He said this is a violation of states' rights and federal overreach. This was a part of the larger 2016 Russian interference scandal brouhaha. If anyone remembers that at this point, I really hope they do not. In the next year, a lawsuit alleged that Georgia's voter data system was extremely vulnerable to hacking, perhaps even allowing one to manipulate votes themselves. 3 days after Kemp's office received the lawsuit, the server containing the vulnerable voter data was mysteriously deleted. Brian blamed the mishap on Kennesaw State, who managed the server, but the convenient deletion of evidence stymied the lawsuit, so, good for him.
Kemp's cavalier treatment of Georgian elections makes more sense when you learn that he doesn't seem to want Georgians voting at all. As soon as Brian was in office, he began investigating voter registration drives, especially ones aimed at Asian and Black Americans. His criminal probes into the organizations that registered over 200,000 people resulted in years of harassment and no signs of voter fraud. The Asian American Legal Advocacy Center only found that the voters they had registered were being blocked from voting days before an election in 2012. In response, Kemp announced a public investigation into the organization for voter fraud, which of course found nothing.
Basically, whenever any significant amount of people of color got registered at once, which registering to vote is not trivial in Georgia. It's not done automatically. And there are voter drives where thousands of people will be signed up in short spans, and Brian Kemp thinks that's all very, very worthy of investigation, especially depending on the melanin concentrations of the people doing the registrating and being signed up.
Kemp was more successful when it came to purging registrations that already existed. His exact match policy required voters to have their name and personal information matched totally across all government documentation. A single letter hyphen out of place will get a registered voter purged from the rolls. If your name is listed as Thomas on your driver's license and Tom on your voter registration, you are out. If a public servant mistyped your name while entering it into the database, you are out. You would not be informed of this. You could show up to vote and be turned away.
It took years for this policy to go into effect, and it only did so after the Supreme Court gutted the Voting Rights Act. From 2013 to 2015, over 75% of the 31,000 voters purged were people of color. Kemp suspended the program after he was sued, but implemented it again in 2017. That year, he purged over 600,000 Georgians from the rolls, and I've seen estimates that he's purged over 1.4 million voters from the rolls, which is like 10% of the voters. Obviously, purging voters is a thing that happens normally and in ways that aren't shady, like people die, they should be taken off the list. But this kind of extreme, shall we say, I'm just really concerned about voter fraud is, pretty strange when you learn that voter fraud basically does not exist in the United States. American elections are weirdly near impossible to rig. Everyone makes hay about how individual polling places and polling systems are very badly secured and badly run, and that's very true. It wouldn't be hard for a person to hack into a machine or two. The thing is, the United States conducts tens of thousands of elections every year, all in disparate polling precincts of thousands of counties across the nation, and rigging enough of them to make any degree of impact is functionally impossible. And when you note the amount of criminal penalty for such an action, or even an attempted action, it makes sense why basically no one does it. So if Kemp's putting in this much work and effort to purge, it's probably because he has a different motivation. The run-up to the 2018 election, of course, saw scores of Georgians register to vote, many of them for the first time. Many of these new voter registrations were facilitated by drives run by Stacey Abrams. Abrams is generally considered to be one of the most talented Democrats in the country at getting people who never participated in democracy to vote for the first time. She spent years traveling to rural and urban locations all across Georgia to register voters of all backgrounds. By 2018, she was nationally recognized by the Democratic Party for her talent at mobilizing voters, which is being done at a much higher rate than in similar states. This is, of course, why Joe Biden proceeded to snub Abrams for the VP nomination in 2020 in favor of a party hack from California who couldn't out-fundraise Andrew Yang. Biden's Georgian victory in 2020 was generally credited to only being possible because of years of work by Abrams and her companions. Seeing as Abrams was both the Democrat nominee in 2018 and was also the woman behind the state's largest voter registration drives, it makes sense that she would quickly notice that over 50,000 registrations would be blocked by the exact match policy in 2018. Only 20% of them belong to white people.
Indeed, Kemp purged over 1.4 million voters all the way up to his own election, over 10% of the rolls. He also closed over 200 polling places before the election. This was ostensibly a cost-saving measure, or out of concerns with disability access, but the majority of these locations just happened to be in predominantly African-American neighborhoods of Atlanta. Brian Kemp was being sued for civil rights offenses all the way up to the end of the race in 2018. He won the race by 50,000 votes and personally ran the election as Secretary of State. Kemp had only become Secretary of State after his predecessor stepped down before running for governor in her primary, but Brian wanted to ensure his victory.
This is a Secretary of State, like, The idea that you could run in an election that you supervised is manifestly and obviously corrupt. And it was a general, not a hard rule on the books, but a general societal rule and understanding that everyone thought was logical, that you would step down before running an election if you're the guy who runs the elections. And the immediate predecessor of Kemp had done this. This was a norm in the Georgian Republican Party at the time. And he was like, nah.
I can't help but think that, like, surely if he did step down, it would have just been another Republican who probably would have done the same stuff.
Yeah.
And wouldn't have gotten bad PR for any of this, but I don't know, what do I know? I mean, he got away with it, so I guess it worked.
He got away with it, and it was successful, so maybe it was the right decision.
Yeah, and, given all this fuckery and manifest corruption, Stacey Abrams refused to concede the election to Brian Kemp. Voter suppression continued under Kemp's term as governor. In 2021, he passed into law more restrictions on Georgia voters, making it harder to vote absentee and restricting ballot drop boxes. It also banned giving out food and water to those standing in line to vote. Georgia's longest voting lines are in black-dominated sections of Atlanta, which is, of course, where Kemp had closed polling places and forced more people to use fewer offices.
Funny how that works. This bill was heavily protested in the months running up from its passing, and it was pared back heavily from its original form, which sought to ban early voting on Sundays. It was generally seen as a response to Biden's win in 2020, an attempt to correct a mistake in the system. So, you can't call Georgia elections rigged. I mean, you can if you want. Go on. This is a democratic process, but it's a democratic process that's being actively mucked with, and manifestly mucked with. I should be said, for all of this, I think that these are bad intentions. I think trying to stop people to vote is a douchebag thing. It is a failure in a country that says that it stands for democracy and freedom. I do think some Democrat concerns over this are, the concern is valid, but the amount of damage this stuff is going to do is pretty unclear. There's not a ton of evidence that all of the roll purging, the pulling of the closing of polling places, and restricted absentee ballots is going to heavily affect the outcome of elections. You're probably getting a fraction of a percentage point. And now in Georgia, we've noted how the races are so close, 55,000 votes, that a fraction of a percentage point could do it. Most experts actually think gerrymandering is far and away the most effective tactic at manipulating elections, and voter restrictions like the one Kemp fought for probably only make small impacts. Regardless, we know that Brian thinks his efforts are worth it. During 2018, a recorder was snuck into a campaign event closed to press. Here, Kemp was recorded saying that absentee ballots and increased registration from the Abrams campaign represented a threat to his election, quote, especially if everyone uses and exercises their right to vote. Half to 40% of Georgians don't vote in elections. More than the number who vote for Republicans, more than the number who vote for Democrats. The winner of every election is I didn't or couldn't participate. And Kemp knows that if that weren't true, he would never be in power. So one might assume that given Kemp's flamboyant personal style during the 2018 election, that he would use his office to raise his profile. It makes sense that he would join governors like Ron DeSantis and Greg Abbott in pushing Republican culture war. But Kemp mostly kept out of the news during his term. All of this had to do with his popularity dipping severely in 2020 due to his handling of coronavirus and the election. Let's look at both of these instances.
As I'm sure our audience is all well aware of, the first half of 2020 was almost completely defined by the COVID-19 pandemic. We won't bore you all with, a detailed history of the disease, as frankly, basically everyone already knows that story by now.
Yeah, I'm not doing 45 minutes on how viruses mutate and spread from one animal to another, and
Yeah.
no one cares
Yeah.
about that shit. COVID happened.
Yeah. To just provide a brief overview of the timeline as it pertains to the topic of today's episode. On January 21st of 2020, the CDC confirmed the detection of the first case of the 2019 novel coronavirus in the United States. This was several weeks after the first individuals began to show signs of the disease in Wuhan, China. This patient had flown from Wuhan to Washington State, and, this entry of the virus into the U.S. would not be alone. The virus would be introduced independently to the country in multiple locations, but Washington State would play host to the first cluster of COVID cases in America. COVID would spread across the country in February, though the true threat posed by the disease remained poorly understood by both governments and the general public.
I'd like to pause here to note that when I first heard about COVID, I did not think that it was going to be a big deal. I assumed that the news agencies were blowing it out of proportion, because in my head a pandemic was like the perfect news story, right? Like you could write a new headline every 6 hours, where it is, how many infected, how many dead.
It's it's one of those things where, like, depending on how old you are, we've all lived through like multiple like stories of, like, avian bird flu and swine flu,
Ebola.
and, if you go back, like SARS, whereas like these were real diseases and they killed people, and like we shouldn't say that they didn't do anything, but they didn't become, the second coming of the Spanish flu or whatever, some people were very worried about.
And when we look back at a lot of our actions, when I look back at a lot of my actions in early 2020, it's like kind of bizarre because the age of plague would greatly change our lives. Jay, I know you work mostly from home, but I worked in a retail job that could not be closed for its public health utility. And so I worked frontline the entire pandemic. And, I changed a lot. The way I saw things changed a lot as it went. But early on, late February, early March, most people were convinced that it wasn't going to be a big deal. That
I went to
go away.
I went to an anime convention in the middle of February 2020. Like, people weren't doing anything. But the first confirmed death caused by COVID in the U.S., at least, the first confirmed at that time, I believe it has been, since then we figured out it happened earlier. But this occurred on February 29th, just days after the CDC put out a warning bracing the public to expect mitigation efforts, including school and workplace closings, restrictions on public gatherings, and other actions that could cause a severe disruption to everyday life. By March, an increasing realization as to the gravity of the situation began to set in as the CDC announced the presence of COVID in over 10 states. President Trump declared a national emergency on the 13th, 2 days after the World Health Organization formally declared the situation a pandemic. The first statewide stay-at-home orders followed shortly, with over 20 states entering a lockdown by the end of the month. As the executive branch of a state, Brian Kemp and his government were naturally kept well aware of all these developments. On March 2nd, the Georgia Department of Public Health received a risk assessment from Georgia Tech's Center of Health, warning of the likelihood of COVID being a long-term pandemic consisting of multiple waves, and calling on the government to assess restrictions on public gatherings.
It's worth noting both Georgia Tech and Kemp's office are in Atlanta, the same city that hosts the CDC in America. And a lot of these tech people are people who were working with and probably at some time for the CDC. So these are some of the top disease scientists in the country, if not the world.
On March 19th, Dr. Cherie Dunzek, an epidemiologist at the Department of Public Health, wrote a report to Kemp notifying him of the presence of widespread community transmission of COVID-19 in several parts of Georgia. By that point, there were 293 confirmed cases of the disease in Georgia and 25 deaths. 2 days later, Dr. Songmin Ryan Shin, a member of the State Board of Public Health, wrote a report calling upon the governor to issue a statewide lockdown, something that had already been implemented in California, Illinois, and New Jersey, in order to head off the surge in cases. Dr. Shin received no response from the governor's office, and Kemp took little action, leading to the mayor of Atlanta issuing a citywide lockdown order on the 23rd.
Being in Georgia at the time was very disorienting and strange. I remember going to people have asked us, when are you going to do COVID? No one is competent. To which we respond, when COVID's over. I got COVID for the first time 6 weeks ago. On, I think, maybe like the 16th, it was a Friday of March, I was at a college church event, and the Masters, which is this massive golf tournament that totally changes the city for 2 weeks every year, had just been canceled the night before, which has never happened in living memory. So this is like a natural disaster kind of situation, is what's going down. And everyone is trying to avoid talking about COVID, but then we all wind up talking about COVID. I call my grandparents, and I remember telling them that I probably wouldn't be able to see them until May, which, yeah. My family actually went on vacation to the beach that weekend, and so I just got to sit in my house alone while suffering from seasonal pollen allergies and just growing paranoid out of my mind that I was sick. No one knew what was going on. There was no direction from the top. There was no clue on what was going to be needed or done. Everyone was taking action on individual basis. And for a lot of people, a lot of Georgians, the first sign that something was wrong was not the actions of the government, the people who are elected to safeguard the health of the nation, of the state, excuse me. It was the actions of private actors, and I'll talk more about that later. There were times when I lived in Columbia County, worked in Richmond County, where I had my boss print out like a sheet of paper that I stashed in my glove compartment that proved of my employment in the city, because we assumed that I would be that anyone driving would be pulled over by cops, and why are you not locked down? Now, when you think about Georgia, that is a completely laughable concept, but we thought it might happen in late March, early April, and a huge reason there was so much confusion was this lack of communication from the top. I have more to say about the Georgian personal view of the pandemic, but Jay, keep going.
Kemp did limit some large gatherings and ordered the closure of bars and nightclubs on the 23rd, followed by schools on the 26th, but refrained from issuing a statewide stay-at-home order until April 2nd. In a press conference on the 2nd, Kemp stated that he had only been made aware in the last 24 hours that the disease could be spread by asymptomatic individuals. Now, this is in spite of how health officials, such as Dr. Fauci at the White House, were talking about the existence of asymptomatic transmission as early as January.
Yeah, Kemp was fucking talking about this shit like in fucking April. He was saying that there was no asymptomatic he was even saying it wasn't even airborne. Like, we all thought it was surfaces back then. I spent so much time bleach watching every surface in the business every hour on the hour, because we thought it was about what you touched, not about most people weren't even wearing masks at that point. And Kemp blatantly propagated that misinformation.
Even then, Kemp refused to issue a mask mandate and declared that the measures implemented in other states were an overreach. Georgia would end up being one of the last states to implement a stay-at-home order and one of the first states to lift it.
Fun fact, only Georgia State Police could enforce the stay-at-home order. There were Georgia sheriffs who called and asked for permission to be able to enforce the stay-at-home order because, there's not a lot of state cops. And they were not given it. It was basically completely... It was kayfabe. It was pro wrestling. The stay-at-home order did not exist, and then it went away like 6 weeks later.
Yeah, on April 20th, with the total amount of COVID-related deaths in the state reaching around 800, Kemp announced that he would let this order expire at the end of the month and allow several non-essential businesses to reopen, a move that even Trump described as being, quote, too soon. As such, the end of April saw the lifting of several COVID restrictions. By the end of May, nightclubs, bars, and amusement parks would all be reopened. Kemp's handling of the situation had proven to be very divisive, to say the least, with one May poll of 12 major states finding that Kemp had the lowest approval rating of any of their governors for his handling of the pandemic, a mere 39%. The next lowest, Governor Abbott of Texas, was at 57%. One of the more entertaining artifacts from the entire COVID pandemic in Georgia was a graph put out by the Department of Public Health early on in May. At first glance, this graph appeared to show a downwards trend in COVID cases in 5 Georgia counties, a clear sign of success of the governor's policies. A closer examination, however, reveals something that's a little bit off. The dates plotted on the x-axis of the graph are completely out of order. Just to briefly read through them, the dates on this graph go from April 28th, April 27th, April 29th, May 1st, April 30th, May 4th, May 6th, May 5th, May 2nd, May 7th, April 26th, May 3rd, May 8th, May 9th.
What a crazy mistake, Jay. That's just it's a crazy error.
Yeah.
Maybe this person was tired, overworked, stressed out. Maybe they had a toddler in their lap that was distracting them, and they just accidentally rearranged all of the dates to make it look like it was trending downwards completely. Just lying. The man lied. The man just lied, blatantly and publicly, and was never punished for it.
Throughout the crisis, Kemp had argued that individuals and communities, not the state, would stop the pandemic. The summer would see just how well the public could contain the transmission of the disease when left to their own devices. As it turns out, not particularly well. The lifting of restrictions led to a massive increase in cases beginning in June. Quoting from a July 16th NPR article by Wayne Drash, Georgia has seen coronavirus cases skyrocket as residents have gone about business as usual in recent weeks. Cases have topped 127,000, and more than 3,000 lives have been taken. Just 3 weeks ago, the overall cases stood at just 69,000.
Yeah, Georgia was doing a solid 9/11 every few months.
Due to all these cases, mayors of cities including Atlanta, Savannah, Augusta, and Rome issued their own mask mandates, only to have those mandates overturned by executive order from the governor on July 15th. Kemp would go so far as to sue the governor of Atlanta, Keisha Lance Bottoms, over the mask mandate, though the lawsuit was eventually dropped in August after mounting evidence that his actions were unconstitutional.
So if you live outside of the United States, and if you live in certain parts of the United States, the way that COVID was treated is going to sound utterly ridiculous. Unless you lived in a few very specific counties, Georgia did not go into lockdown. There was no real effort to stop transmission at a government level. For me, there was a lockdown in Richmond County, but not in Columbia County. You would drive from one into the other and just like see the cars stopping on, there being like way less cars in the street. It was really eerie. This might sound crazy, but people just kept doing what they were doing. Eventually, by the high summer, by like June, July, they started wearing masks. Not because they had to, but because Walmart was requiring them to wear masks. And that actually started enlisting in people some degree of habit for a while. I would say mask use like peaked in August of 2020. And remember, I'm like seeing people every day coming to my laundromat and having to tell them to wear a fucking mask. And again, I never got COVID throughout that entire time of dealing with customers constantly, face to face, very close to them, because the masks fucking worked.
Yeah.
And, during the summer, Jordans are outside a lot. The disease was not as bad. But, again, to a lot of y'all, it might seem that Georgia had not done anything to really mitigate the pandemic. But to Georgians, a lot of us felt like we had come together and fought the disease. Or at least we had spent what political energy we had to come together and fight the disease. And so generally, as October went into November, went into December, there was an idea that like, well, that period is over. And that fall in winter is when we saw people starting to really get the disease everywhere. A lot of people in my church got it. It felt like a snake was coiling around us. Obviously, a lot of this has to do with the fact that a bunch of people in America that are not as, shall we say, concentrated to one side of the political spectrum as a lot of people think, didn't think COVID was that big a deal. And Kemp's strategy was to leave this up to private people and to private groups. Again, a lot of people started wearing masks because Walmart made them. Because if the governments won't be governments, then the corporations will be governments. And there's nothing wrong with that. A lot of churches chose to stay open, and a lot of churches chose to close. There were shouting match arguments between my preacher and my fucking children's minister over whether or not they were going to close, and my pastor closed the church, and no one died. And it was all of these individual decisions, and a lot of individual decisions saved a lot of lives. But Kemp, like, the reason there was so much argument over about whether or not COVID was something to be taken seriously, the reason that there was so much cavalier attitudes or so many ideas that we have to reopen, we have to restart the economy, is because Kemp left Georgians to the wolves. He never took the disease seriously. He never took lives seriously. And he actively fed Georgians into the fire, making it illegal to put in mask mandates and business restrictions, which was against the Georgian Constitution. That's why he stopped doing it. And he did this so much that Donald Trump said it was extreme. This is the kind of man that we had to deal with in the pandemic.
Yeah. Throughout the course of the pandemic, Kemp would stay firm in his stance against tougher measures, generally citing economic reasons for his position. Georgia consistently lagged behind the national average in terms of testing and eventually vaccination once those vaccines started being rolled out, while exceeding the average in terms of deaths. As of September 12, 2022, Georgia has had a COVID-19 death rate of 376 deaths per 100,000 people, which is the 13th worst in the Union. A total of 38,468 Georgians have died of the disease.
12 9/11s, people.
Yep.
12 9/11s, and no one gives a shit.
Throughout 2020, Kemp lied about the disease, ignored warnings of officials, and actively fought against measures that would have saved lives. He sat atop a culture that largely chose to ignore the human cost of keeping the economy open.
The other significant event of 2020 was, of course, the election, in which Kemp plays a very strange role. With its 16 votes in the Electoral College, Georgia represents a decent prize for whichever candidate wins it. The last Democrat to carry the state was Bill Clinton in '92, but polling going into the 2020 election showed a very tight race between Biden and Trump. Worth noting that even though polling was widely off in much of America during 2020, the Georgian polling was strangely accurate, or at least far more accurate than in other parts of the nation. On the eve of the election, polling aggregator website 538 gave Biden a lead of just 1.2%, while the website 270 to win had Biden being up only 0.2 points, and RCP had Trump up by 0.1. And all of those are, of course, well within the margin of error. It was a toss-up.
Now, as most of you probably recall, the events of the election night of November the 3rd and the following few days were rather contentious, to say the least. The coronavirus pandemic led to a sharp rise in mail-in voting. These mail-in ballots were in turn set to be counted after the in-person ballots in many locations, and since Democrats were seen as more likely to vote by mail, many experts predicted that the results on election night would appear to favor Trump before shifting to Biden. This was a so-called red shift and blue shift. This is exactly what happened. The early results coming in on election night seemed to point to Trump having the advantage, but crucially lacking the 270 electoral votes required to win the presidency, and as more ballots were counted, things suddenly shifted in favor of Biden. With Georgia followed this trend as well, with counting pointing towards the results being incredibly close, but eventually leaning in Biden's favor. In the end, Biden would be pushed above 270 on November 7th, when the major networks called Pennsylvania for him, while Georgia remained uncalled as the state had entered a hand audit. The state would ultimately be called for Biden by the Associated Press on November 13th, as the results of the audit came in. In the end, after both the audit and a recount, Biden would win the state with 49.47% of the vote to Trump's 49.24%. You had a fun election night, didn't you?
Oh yes, Jay. Why do you think I had a fun election night?
Well, I remember.
Why would you specifically
being in a Discord call with you and some of our other friends and enjoying that?
4 hours brief to you. Yeah, I had a we had a fun old. We had a fun old time. It was all recounted. The first count lasted until Saturday. I remember coming out of band practice on Thursday evening, and thinking Trump had won the state, and learning that he was only up by like 3,000 votes. And then we woke up on Friday to just one tiny little shred of fucking decency. Not that we were allowed to keep it. All right, like this was an election cycle that was extremely polarized for Georgia. You had clashing protesters, you had clashing rallies. You had, a bunch of Democrats think that the state was stolen in the last election. A bunch of Republicans think that Georgia's a solid red state and there's no way it could go for Biden unless there's been, manifest rigging. We were also doing 2 Senate elections at the time because Johnny Eisen's fucking dementia-riddled brain, he dragged his bloated corpse of a body across the finish line for so long that Kemp had to pull him out of there, replace him with fucking Kelly Loeffler, who's literally only put in there because she was one of the largest private donors to the Republicans in Georgia. And she was like supposed to appeal to suburban white women and be like more moderate. That was the whole idea. And then she proceeds to like just completely go full in to the most to simultaneously the most like far right Trumpism while also being the most openly corrupt insider trading laden member of Congress. Even more so than like Dianne Feinstein and Nancy Pelosi. She was fucking just blatantly using information to rig her portfolio.
Yeah.
And we had to go into runoffs for those two. We had to do the vicious 2020 political debate. Georgians had to do it for 2 more months. And we finally fucking elected a Jewish dork and the pastor of Martin Luther King's church as our senators. We fucking did that.
Yeah.
We got the Dems the majority.
Yeah.
You're welcome for that $1,400, by the way. Georgians got to. It was very close, but we woke up. We went to the polls on January 5th, and we fought again, and we woke up the next morning, and we had a really fine first 4 hours of that day.
And, as we all know, President Trump quite infamously refused to accept his defeat, and thus his lawyers set about challenging the results in various states. We've talked about this a bit before, way back in our episode on Rudy Giuliani, so if you're interested in the topic, you can go and give that one a listen. In Georgia, this challenge came as early as November 4th, when the Trump campaign and Georgia Republican Party filed a lawsuit claiming that late ballots were being counted as if they were on time. This lawsuit was dismissed by the Georgia Supreme Court due to a lack of evidence. Over the course of the following months, Trump's associates and supporters would file 7 more lawsuits challenging various elements of the Georgia election, all of which went nowhere. A Trump campaign request to delay the certification of the election results was turned down by a district court judge appointed by Trump himself. Of course, none of these things are particularly unique about the state of Georgia. Similar challenges were filed across the country. What does stand out about the situation in Georgia, however, is the discourse between Donald Trump and the Georgia state government.
Despite being a Republican, Governor Kemp could clearly see which way the wind was blowing in November of 2020. Trump had clearly lost. He had effectively lost before Georgia had been even called for Biden. The ultimately doomed theatrics of January 6 were obviously yet to occur, but rather than attaching himself to a sinking ship, Kemp stood by the election officials in his state. But perhaps in order to preserve his image with a strong pro-Trump Republican base, remember, this is a guy who rose to power on part of Trump's endorsement, he left much of the actual messaging on what had happened in the election to his Secretary of State, Brad Raffensperger. It was thus Raffensperger and his colleagues that would face the bulk of Trump's attention over the following weeks. Threats of violence poured in, prompting one election official to hold a press conference calling on Trump to, quote, stop inspiring people to commit potential acts of violence. When the official state electors cast their votes for Biden on the 14th of December, pro-Trump Georgia Republicans, LARPing as electors, also cast votes in favor of Trump. The most infamous moment of the whole affair would occur on January the 2nd, when during an hour-long phone call, Trump pressured Raffensperger to overturn the election results in the state. This call was quickly leaked to the press and would go on to form a major part of the second impeachment of Trump on January the 13th. The call would also lead to an ongoing criminal investigation by Fulton County DA Fannie T. Willis into the possibility of election interference. The bad blood between Trump and Raffensperger would spread to Kemp as well. Trump is remembering that this guy he put in office is not doing him any favors. in spite of Kemp's attempts to remain outside the situation. Trump went on to routinely criticize Kemp and even endorsed a primary challenger to him in 2020, David Perdue, who Kemp would crush with 3/4 of the vote. So you ask, where's the incompetency here? Because Kemp did not, go full fascist and try and help Trump overthrow the election. Many people have lauded Kemp for choosing not to fully overthrow democracy. But it's important to note that he did all this as quietly as possible. This is a guy who was in charge of Georgia elections for 8 years, and the president of the country is saying that the entire state's elections are fraudulent in front of God and everybody, and he basically did nothing publicly to push back against that. Instead of pointing out Trump's blatant attempts to intimidate his Secretary of State, Kemp tried to sweep the incident under the rug and essentially wait for Trump to go away, which he's arguably still doing. But to even say that Brian did nothing while Trump tried to take away his people's constitutional rights would be giving the man too much credit.
Indeed, Kemp has spent much of 2022 attempting to stymie the Fulton County investigation. Yet this is likely due to how being seen as aiding the investigation would reduce his support with conservative voters right before the midterms. In August, the governor attempted to quash a subpoena for his testimony, accusing the DA of pursuing it for, quote, political purposes. A judge eventually ruled that Kemp would have to testify in front of a grand jury, but rather conveniently that he could wait until after the midterms to do so. Within 4 years, Kemp went from being endorsed by Trump to having a Trump-endorsed candidate run against him. He weathered that storm by keeping his head down. Kemp's approval rating bottomed out in 2022, but it's mostly recovered since. It's interesting that after a controversial rise to power fueled by the culture war and a rocky first term, Kemp stabilized his rule by keeping out of the news.
Kemp did fend off a primary challenger very well, and he did this by keeping his head down. And you might think that that would mean that his term as governor was, besides the things we've already mentioned, very, very light. That would not be the case. There were major bills introduced and passed into law in Georgia during his term. The largest of these bills have been on abortion criminalization and voting restriction. Both of these were done without big announcements, as Kemp tried to rush the bills through the legislature. The voting restriction bill we discussed earlier was only a national news story because of how heavily it was protested. After weeks of arguments, Kemp signed the bill and fled. When a black congresswoman knocked on his office door to discuss the new law, police took her into custody. Kemp's official campaign website uses extremely soft language and mostly leads with discussing the economy and promising to make Georgia the best state to raise a family in. This guy is no longer a Trumpist firebrand. He's a solid, dependable steward of the state. That's how he's trying to push himself.
And it makes sense, since popularity ratings tend to rise as a politician stays out of the news. Governors are a particularly boring bunch, even by American political standards. Once you're in power, it seems best to just not give voters any reason to dislike you. Focus on kitchen table issues everyone likes and don't rock the boat. The last 20 years have seen plenty of states that lean Democrat slightly or moderately be ruled by Republican governors. These guys are all uniformly white, boring, and appear on television as little as possible. Kemp seems to have joined their club, and if you think of Brian as a moderate governor who's leading a swing state, that makes sense.
Brian Kemp is not a moderate. Let's talk about what he and his party have inflicted on Georgia. In 2014, the Affordable Care Act expanded Medicaid in America. Now, millions of poor Americans will be given health insurance by the federal government. A ridiculously dumb flaw in the law allowed individual states to turn down that particular part of the bill. It allowed state legislatures to choose that Medicaid would not be expanded within their state. The Georgian Republican Party chose to stop hundreds of millions of dollars from helping the people of Georgia. I cannot comprehend how many people have gone without medicine, avoided a doctor, or died because they didn't have the health care they were owed by that bill. Republicans chose to let those people die. I know people who tell their friends, like, hey, if anything happens to me, don't call an ambulance. I can't afford it. This is a very obese, overweight state. There's a lot of people who need insulin, etc. In 2021, Kemp tried to roll back the state's existing Medicaid program for those who had it and add draconian work requirements, which had been proven for years not to work. The Biden administration stopped him, but that's what Kemp worked to do. Make sure less people in his state could afford to pay for their medical bills.
Yeah, like just to talk a little bit about healthcare briefly, a lot of people outside the United States, wonder a lot about the American healthcare system. And, a lot of people say well, there's no free healthcare in America. And largely that is true. But nowadays, in a lot of states, if your income is below a certain point, or you don't have any income, you can submit your paperwork, prove your residency and do all that, and get a state-funded private insurance plan that will cover almost all your expenses. I have a friend who got this for Illinois, and it was a fair amount of paperwork, but once they did it, they basically had to pay nothing. They got an insurance plan that covered hundreds and hundreds of dollars of medical expenses. They didn't have to pay anything. And that's possible because of expanded Medicaid. Georgia is one of the states where that doesn't exist.
And to be clear, the federal government was offering to pay for 100% of the cost of this for 10 years, and then 90% after that. This basically would have a very small effect on the state budget. You have a dump truck of money backing into the front lawn of the state, and they said, nope, shoot away. We don't want none of that.
Now, Georgia's public schools rank 36th in the nation, according to a comprehensive study conducted by WalletHub. Meanwhile, Georgia's population has the 13th highest poverty rate out of all U.S. states and territories, the 12th largest number of homeless individuals, and the 11th highest level of income inequality. To top it all off, Georgia has the 8th highest maternal mortality rate, with 28.8 deaths per 100,000 live births between 2018 and 2020.
Remember, this is a state that is one of the most economically productive and powerful in the country.
It's a little bit funny looking up a lot of these statistics because Georgia will be like the 12th to 13th. They're consistently that's about where it ranks. And that's more or less because the lowest dozen states in most of these categories tends to be the South, quote unquote. The former Confederacy plus a couple that are thrown in. And Georgia tends to be on the top in the South, but below the rest of the country.
Yes, because it's richer than the rest of the South. And I was actually shocked to see that you found that we were 36th in public schools. I always heard we were 49 for 50th when I was in school. I could go on a rant about the various different kinds of failed education reforms in Georgia that I lived through. Never mind all of the other ones, but this podcast is already too long. In 2019, Kemp signed a law banning an abortion in Georgia once a heartbeat can be detected in a fetus. This generally occurs around 5 or 6 weeks in, often before someone fully knows that they are pregnant. Humans have always had abortions. Women in Jesus' time did them constantly. For most of history, this has not been controversial. Now that the Supreme Court has voided Roe v. Wade, Kemp's law has gone into effect, taking the rights away of anyone pregnant. The 14th Amendment was written to end slavery in the United States. It sought to give people full control over their bodies and their ability to have families. If you couldn't regulate that, you couldn't be free. Georgia's terrible education system leaves lots of people behind. Millions of Georgians work low-wage jobs that are backbreaking, humiliating, and don't allow them to save money. Schedules changing every week. Having to try and work outside family connections and neighborhood connections to get childcare for your kids. Basically, zero unionization and right to work state where you can be fired for any reason. I've spent years around these people. I've spent years around the people who look down upon them. The poor of Georgia are not dumb. They know exactly when they can take care of a child. They know exactly what will happen if they raise a child around their situation, one that might include hunger, instability, and abuse. I know 2 people my age who got pregnant as teenagers, mistakes they weren't able to undo. They love their kids. They love their kids tremendously. They are working way harder than I ever will to provide for them. Lack of childcare makes it hard for them to keep a job, to have a life, to invest in themselves in any way that will pull them out of poverty. I think my friend was living in a single-wide trailer with 4 other people the last time I saw her. Kemp's Georgia now enslaves millions of women to lives of poverty and misery. When I was 2 years old, my mother had a miscarriage. It was very hard for my parents to have me. They tried for 5 years before they did. Eventually, I would have a sister, but between that, there was a miscarriage. It was a moment of intense grief for her, intense guilt, but she had very good health care, and she made a full recovery. I wonder what it would have been like in 2000 for police to have knocked on her door and demanded to investigate her for a crime when that had happened. Kemp's Georgia now claims to have full jurisdiction over the bodies of its citizens. It will help none of them survive what they have been cursed with. Last week, a friend of mine in her 30s had a surgical procedure to remove her fallopian tubes. She sterilized herself. She always knew she didn't want to have children. She'd been thinking about getting this procedure for years for reasons that are her own. This summer's developments pushed something that she thought might be reasonable to do into something she thought was necessary. Women are going to do what they have to do to survive and control their lives. They will take the risks the government makes them take. They will risk the punishments the government will enforce upon them. This is reality. You cannot question it. The only question is how many people are going to die.
Brian Kemp is a privileged man who doesn't really care about rights or democracy. He's a boring coward who bends to the political winds and takes whatever side he needs to glorify himself. He and his party are comfortable imparting an obscene amount of violence onto Georgians. Not only are they actively standing in the way of anyone's lives getting better, they've made them worse. If Kemp and his ilk get another term, they will do worse. They will hurt more people. They will throw more Georgians to the wolves of this world to be torn apart by its poverty and violence. If you live in Georgia and you can vote, you should. Help get this incompetent fascist out of office. It's good for you. It's good for everyone else. Kemp is up for re-election on November 8th. The only way he leaves office is to vote for his opponent, Stacey Abrams. You can't vote for a third-party candidate. If you want him out, that's what you'll have to do. The deadline to register to vote in Georgia is October 11th. Your job is to get yourself and everyone you know in Georgia registered before then. Make a plan to get to the polling place. Georgia has a pretty extensive early voting. There are plenty of days to go. I know Azalea apparently has never waited more than 30 minutes. If you don't live in Georgia, such as myself, contact your friends that do and talk to them about voting.
I want to close with several arguments to people who might be on the fence about Kemp and who might really hate me for all of this. I think I've already proven my bona fides, but guys, my family keeps old chicken noodle soup in mason jars. I've almost been killed by a cow when I was a teenager. I fucking... I'm Georgian. All right? I'm Georgian, and when I was 14, I became a Christian, and that was one of the only reasons that I didn't end up killing myself as a teenager. I care about this state, and I have always wanted to be of this state, even when I was a kid, even when I knew nothing about politics. I mean, it was just some dumb, autistic 10-year-old. Like, I liked that I was from the South. I liked that I was beginning to cultivate an accent. A lot of people told me to get rid of it. A lot of people told me not to say y'all, that it made me sound dumb, and I refused to. I'm a redneck. I'm a Southerner. I'm a Georgian. That is part of my identity. It is part of how I identify. It is part of how I see myself. You can look at me and my lifestyle and my values, and you can say that I'm not that. I don't fucking care. That is how I see myself. So, let's talk to a few different people about why you should vote for Stacey Abrams, who, by the way, I'm not super over the moon for. I think she's a very complicated, flawed candidate. All candidates are, of course. I don't think she's ideal. There never will be an ideal candidate, but she's who we've got to use to beat this motherfucker. Okay, so let's say you are a Republican who really likes the economic policies of the party. Okay, you know, you need your taxes low, you need regulations low. But buddy, I fucking get it. You can vote for Abrams with your conscience clear. Okay, her platform is to keep every tax credit and business favorable law on the books. Guys, she is not going to have the support in the legislature to change anything in that category. Even if she wanted to, she will not be able to pass gun control. She won't. Even the incredibly moderate gun control position she has, which I disagree with, by the way, she will not be able to pass them. Fear-mongering about that is pointless. She basically will probably, if she is voted into office, she probably will not be able to do much except stop even more vile policies from affecting our state, which you know these people are going to do. They are not going to stop with a 15-week ban or a 6-week ban. They're going to go forward with more and more extreme punishing measures. Okay, so you are a Christian who thinks that abortion is wrong. I get it. Abortion is a nasty topic. It's a nasty thing to think about. It makes pretty much everyone uncomfortable. But it's part of human life. No part of the Bible claims abortion is wrong, or that a fetus is alive. It's not covered. In Jesus' day, and for thousands of years in Europe after that, it was common and legal for women to end their pregnancies up to and around about 15 weeks in. No one had a problem with this. This was based around an idea called quickening. You can look it up if you want. Jesus taught you to love your neighbor as yourself. You know your body shouldn't be enslaved to someone else, especially without your consent. You know someone else shouldn't have to go through that either. Okay, you've never voted before. You don't like politics. You think both parties are corrupt. You don't think voting will change anything, or you don't think you know enough about the vote. You know, you sort of see politics as something that's kind of over there, and you're over here, and it's just not your world. Politics is dumb. Politicians are bad. You're right. And it's also scary. It's big. It's way bigger than you. The news is constantly grinding through stories. None of us have any time to understand. No one is qualified to vote, buddy. I promise, the average voter does not know more about this stuff than you do. Senior citizens with their brains leaking out of their ears get to vote. Why shouldn't you? Voting out Kemp will make your life better. He's a threat to you. He's a threat to all of us. Don't let him beat you without a fight. And finally, you are a radical leftist who thinks that Dems aren't enough and that voting propagates an awful system. Whoo, boy, you are the person I have the most in common with. I hate the Democrats. They're evil as shit. I have so much fucking resentment for them. They also got us into all of this fucking mess. They helped put my state into the fucking wreck that it is, just like the Republicans did. The amount of violence and scams, war crimes and shit that they've allowed and helped, even in my lifetime, is crushingly incomprehensible. You still gotta have to fucking vote. All right? Your action of voting is not an alternative to anything. You can vote for Stacey Abrams and then protest her every day she's in office so she does what you want. There is nothing stopping you from doing that. You're an anarchist or you're a socialist or whatever you are because you know that we live in a broken world rigged against everyone that you've ever met. You also think that people deserve something better. Help us give Georgia something better. Not perfect, but better. We don't just deserve that. We need that, or more of us are going to die. And if you're somebody who thinks themselves a radical in Portland or New York or Boston, and you think that I'm tainted, that I'm not an anarchist, that I'm a sellout, that I don't actually care, this is not a fucking game. This is not a joke. This is not something to make myself feel better. All right? There is no feeling good in America. There is surviving. I don't want to watch any of my friends die. I don't want to have to smuggle my sister halfway across the country if she gets raped. I am scared every day. And I have to watch the place that I live get ground into a fascist hellhole. And I will not leave. Because everyone I love is here. And I love it here. For totally illogical reasons. There's nothing special about this hunk of dirt. But it's my home. The people who live here, they deserve better than this guy. They deserve better than Stacey Abrams. They deserve a lot. They work very, very hard. They're nice. They're sweet. They're opinionated. They're loud. I learned a lot from them. You know, a lot of people think that with the changing tide of demographics and aging and whatnot, that, you know, eventually Georgia will go Democrat and more better people will be elected into office and all problems will be solved and it'll all just go away. No, fuck that. Okay, we cannot wait. We are at a crisis. We are in war. We are not being bombed. We are not being shot at. Well, some people are being shot at by police, but that's a different thing. Our people are dying because they don't have health care. People are going to die because they are going to take risky pregnancies to term and because they are going to try and terminate those pregnancies and kill themselves in a state that already has absolutely obscenely bad maternal mortality. They are hurting us. They have declared war on us. And so I'm going to do everything that I have to do to win. Frankly, I curse myself that I don't do more. That's the end of the episode, folks. I fully expect that almost everyone's tuned out far before this. This was kind of the gimme episode. We'll be back to Napoleon. We'll be back to wars. We'll be back to like real headline things next time, I swear. But I couldn't not allow I couldn't let myself not make this episode. I have I'm autistic. I have an anxiety disorder. I'm not a huge fan of calling random people or knocking on doors for political mobilization. I am isolated. I don't have an anarchist network, militia people that can all grab guns and Molotovs and fight the government. This is what I can do, so I did it. And I'm going to stop being emotional and end it now. Wherever you are, whatever you're doing, the fact that you chose to listen to all of this means that you care, and that means you're valuable, and that means that you deserve a better world. Fight for one. Azalea out.